the season's exhibition tonight. Obviously, it closed a little bit earlier than we might have hoped back in December. So it's kind of nice to revisit it. It feels like unfinished business for me. So we're going to look tonight at some of the pictures that were included in the exhibition and a few that were mentioned in the catalogue but weren't actually in the show for a bit of variety. I think just to kick off, I just quickly wanted to thank Jill Clark, who was my co-curator on the exhibition, for all her help with it. And some of the work that's in the talk tonight were paintings that she wrote about in the catalogue, and I'm grateful to her for sharing her information and knowledge with me. The exhibition The Seasons was intended as a reminder of the joys of seasonal change at a time when many of us are becoming increasingly remote from those kind of natural rhythms of the year. And the last lockdown gave many of us a chance to sort of reconnect with nature and appreciate the everyday wonders of spring coming in. And I think we're perhaps a bit of deja vu this year. We're doing the same thing again at the moment. Some of these phenomena that I'll be talking about tonight are under threat. Some of them have already disappeared through sort of historical change. But really the exhibition was intended to kind of celebrate that and to hope that these things might yet survive and be there for future generations as well. Right, well, we're beginning in winter, and then we're going to work our way through the 4 seasons this evening. So winter, a time of short days and darkness, when nature appears dormant or even dead, and the festivals that were held around the shortest day at the winter solstice were intended to lighten the dark. It was a season for seeking comfort round the hearth. For the artists, snow scenes have always provided something a little bit different, a little bit unusual, but actually the word winter originates in German language, meaning from words meaning wet, so it's literally the wet season. Trees are bare, flowers are mostly absent, the landscape can appear drab and lifeless. And on the farm, traditionally ploughing went on until Christmas, but otherwise it was a season for jobs like hedging and ditching and threshing. And the pagan festival of Imbolc on the 1st of February marked the start of the lambing season and the first stirrings of new life. So we're beginning tonight with this watercolour by John Nash. It's called Wild Garden Winter, painted in 1959. And it shows his home in near Wormingford on the Suffolk-Essex border. He moved to Bottengom's farm in 1944, and it was virtually derelict at that time. And he was very proud of the work that he did in restoring the house and laying out and planting the gardens. And here you can see one of the ponds in his gardens and some newly planted saplings beyond. During the summers, Nash would travel all over the UK with friends like Edward Borden on painting holidays, sketching holidays. But during the winter, his subject matter was his home and the surrounding countryside. And here you can see Bottengoms in the snow on a kind of a grey day, and he's beautifully captured that sort of dim light that you get when we've recently had snow or more snows on the way. And that kind of palette that he's used of sort of blues and greens and things binds the whole thing together. So it's a really lovely sort of peaceful evocation of England in winter. This is something completely different. This wasn't actually in the exhibition. There was so much that we could have chosen for this show. The Seasons is such a popular subject with artists and with writers. This is by an artist called Adrian Allinson. And Allinson studied at the Slade, along with people like Paul Nash and Stanley Spencer, Edward Wadsworth. He was one of that generation. He's probably best known today for posters. He did railway posters and London Underground posters. And his paintings are marked by this kind of sort of dramatic lighting effects and heightened colour that gives them a sort of slightly magical feel. I think you can really see that in this winter snowscape. There's kind of a childlike sense of wonder here. And you can see just down in the foreground, there's a little fox creeping into the garden. There's someone feeding their chickens a little bit further on. So let's hope she locks them up at the end of the day. But actually down here in the south, snowfall is fairly rare. It's not something that we see a lot. Probably our day-to-day experience of winter is a bit more like this. This is a watercolour by Eric Gravilius. It's called The Downs in Winter, and it was painted in 1934. and it really kind of captures that sort of watery weak light on a slightly overcast day, just sort of lending a little bit of warmth to the what's otherwise a fairly bleak looking landscape. This is the Sussex Downs. You can see there's hardly a hedge in sight. There's an abandoned farm roller in the foreground, its work having been done in the previous season. Revilius is sort of come to prominence now. He was a little bit forgotten sort of towards the later part of the 20th century, but he was born in Eastbourne. The Downs of Sussex and the Sussex coast were a major source of inspiration for him, subjects of many of his watercolour paintings. During the Second World War, he was a war artist, and tragically, he was one of only 3 war artists who were killed during the war. He was up in Iceland and was sent off on or decided to join a reconnaissance air-sea rescue mission, and his plane never returned. So a sad loss, but today he's probably one of the most popular 20th century British artists around, and you see his work a great deal. This is a bit more close to home. This is simply titled The New Forest. It's by Frederick Golden Short, and it was painted in 1900, and it shows a kind of classic New Forest heathland scene in sort of late winter, those kind of drab duns, browns and ochres that you tend to see, a few ponies and some little patches of sunlight pulling out a stand of trees in the distance, and the odd gorse flower. Now gorse, there's the saying goes, that when gorse is out of flower, kissing's out of fashion. And the intention behind this being that there's always gorse flowers around. You can always find a few, and there you can see a smattering of them here. Golden Short was born in Lyndhurst, and the New Forest was really his main subject for most of his life. He was a familiar figure seen cycling around the area with his paint box and easel strapped to his back, and much of his work is based around the heathland and woodland scenes of our area. Okay, gardens, again, another sort of a place where a lot of us experience seasonal changes in our closest environment, our gardens and our parks. This is a painting by Evelyn Dunbar. It was painted, she actually painted it off and on over the course of about 8 years, between 1929 and 1937, and it shows the garden of her family home in Strood near Rochester, and it kind of conjures up that kind of almost sort of winter emptiness. You can see all that bare earth, but it's kind of a promise of things to come. There's some good colour to that soil, and you think there might be some planting going on and some things to look forward to soon. And the bare trees and that slightly watery light sort of conjures up again a bit like the Nash. It's a fairly gentle evocation of winter in England. This is something a little bit different. It's an etching by Graham Sutherland. It was made in 1929. It's called Cottage in Dorset, Wood End. And it's rather a different take on winter. It's an eerie take on winter. And I have to use this opportunity to plug our autumn exhibition here, because this picture will be reappearing at St Barbe in September. We're doing a show called Unsettled Landscapes, the Art of the Eerie, which is looking at a kind of a thread in British art running from about 1920 to the present, looking at eerie landscapes. And we got Robert McFarlane has written an essay for the catalogue, so that's something quite exciting to look forward to later in the year, all being well. But back to Sutherland. Yes, it's an eerie showing of winter with this slightly derelict looking cottage and the bare trees, leaves blowing. You can see a partially cut haystack on the left hand side there. Sutherland had studied etching at the Goldsmith School of Art, along with a little group of etchers who were very inspired by Samuel Palmer, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on. This is sort of coming towards the end of the time when he sort of gave up etching, and he was moving into slightly sort of darker, bleaker, stranger landscapes. But there's still a slightly Palmery feel to it all the same. Okay, we're back to the New Forest with this one. This is Sven Berlin. This was painted in 1955 and it's called Gypsies in the Snow. Berlin had been living down in St Ives and left the kind of art community there because he was fed up with all the fighting that was going on between the abstract artists and the figurative artists. And he came up to the New Forest in a gypsy wagon. Pretty arduous journey, and they arrived in winter with no money and just this wagon to live in, and poor health and a sick child. And they were really quite lucky in being almost adopted by the local gypsies, who sort of showed them how to live the itinerant life, supported them, even gave them money for painting wagons and things like that. And in return, I think Berlin got to know them. He was accepted by them to a remarkable degree, and he really kind of captured the final days of their traditional lives in the New Forest. I say traditional, this was at a time when they were either allowed to live in compounds, there were about 5 or 6 compounds dotted across the forest, or they had to move into council housing. And this shows the compound at Shave Green, which is just off the Lyndhurst-Cadnam road heading north. And Berlin wrote in a book about, he wrote sort of autobiography of that time. He said, "I'd seen them here in the snow when each figure of man or woman or child stood out as in a Lowry painting, the colours iridescent, the flames of the fires burning bright orange." And he's really, that's sort of what he's captured in that painting there. And it was a hard life, you know, living under the trees in the summer was one thing, but in winter, when you could only have a tent or a wagon to live in, these were pretty tough times for them. Okay, we're sort of moving in towards the world of farming now. Farming naturally was a big part of the season's show because it has such an impact on the way the landscape looks across the seasons. This is a wood engraving by Claire Leighton. It was made for a book called The Farmer's Year, a calendar of English husbandry, that was published in 1933. The book was hugely popular, ran to 3 editions in just 3 months, and it chronicles the work of the farmer across the year and really focuses on the workers and what they were doing. It's a sort of an unsentimental look at farm work, really at a time when things were changing a great deal, with mechanization coming in and some of the very traditional ways of doing things were disappearing. This is perhaps, but certainly my favorite, I think, but perhaps the strongest image in the set. It's called Lopping, and it's the illustration for February, and it shows a group of men pollarding trees down on a mill stream, and these poles that they're cutting will be used for making hurdles to keep sheep in their proper places. And you can just imagine the sound of those bill hooks kind of echoing across the frozen landscape as they're working away. Leighton, her wood engraving, she loves these sort of big areas of black with kind of just a few white marks to pick out the forms, and it's a very striking element of her work. Okay, one of the things that I was really pleased to put into the show was the Ladybird books, the What to Look For series that were produced between 1959 and 1961, illustrated by C.F. Tunnicliffe, who was one of our kind of greatest wildlife artists. He illustrated over 80 books during his lifetime. He did commercial illustration. He did Brook Bond tea cards. So if you were alive in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you would almost certainly come across his work, even if you didn't know who the artist was. But he was commissioned to provide the illustrations for these 4 books, chronicling what you could find on country walks, down on the farm, in gardens, and by the seaside. And here we've got the front cover of the first book, the What to Look For in Winter. And on the right, one of the illustrations. These are original illustrations that we borrowed from the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading that look after the Ladybird archive. And this one shows mangolds being retrieved from a clamp. So a clamp was a way of storing things like mangolds and potatoes through the winter. They would be covered in straw and then in soil and with ventilation holes down the length of the clamp. And there they could be kept free from water, from damp and from frosts. And those are going to be used to feed the cattle that you can see in the background there. And of course, Tunnicliffe adds to these drawings lots of little details that children can pick out while they're looking through it. You can see there's a kestrel there hovering in the sky, and right down in the bottom left-hand corner, there are 2 mice who've been disturbed probably from their nest in amongst the clamp there, fleeing for their lives. Right, this is the last couple of images for winter, and we're looking at Christmas here. So the illustration on the left is an etching by Robin Tanner. Tanner trained as a teacher in London, but he also attended evening classes at Goldsmiths School, and he became a kind of pastoral etcher in the style of, or not in the style of, but certainly inspired by Samuel Palmer. And he based a lot of his work around the landscape of Wiltshire, around his home where he'd grown up. And he really kind of chronicled the disappearing way of life, the way the landscape was changing, the way farming was changing. So there's kind of a slightly elegiac quality to a lot of his prints. This one's called Christmas, and it was inspired by a nighttime visit to Castle Combe, and he recalled it being slightly eerie, wandering around the village at night and being able to hear the villagers snoring and their bed springs creaking while he was making his sketches. A lot of his pictures are kind of composite scenes, so he'd take things that he'd liked from one place and another and add them in. So bits of this were taken from Castle Combe, others from other places. And you can see there's carol singing going on under the lantern light. There are people dancing in the streets, and there's mistletoe hanging in the doorway of the house from which the light is spilling. On the right-hand side, we have a wood engraving by Gertrude Hermes. This was made in 1930. It's called Mistletoe, and it was one of the illustrations for a book called A Florilegie, chosen from the old herbals, which was a series of engravings around different sorts of plants that would have been found in medieval and later herbals. Hermes was really gifted, one of the greatest wood engravers of the 20th century, and this, you can see, it's a very dynamic image of the mistletoe and this sort of blast of light in between, conjuring up visions of Christmas jollity. And of course, mistletoe very much seen as a symbol of fertility. The Celts saw it as a symbol of male fertility, and for the Romans it was associated with peace and love, and they hung it over their doorways to protect the household as well. Okay, we're now moving into spring, as we are at the moment. Spring, then, the things I suppose we associate with spring: the sap is rising, the birds are singing, the days are getting longer, the sun's getting warmer. And the word spring comes from the Old English springen, meaning to leap, spring up or grow. We have the vernal equinox on the 21st, or round about the 21st of March, when the hours of daylight and darkness are equal. But really, we tend to think of March, April and May as being the months of spring. And of course, Easter is a big feature of this time, and its themes of death and resurrection have a great deal of continuity with the pagan festival of Eostra, that welcome in new life emerging with the new season. The colours change as trees come into leaf, the soil dries, crops begin to grow and the flowers appear. And if you've been out walking around over the last few weeks, you'll have noticed them coming in sequence: the primroses, the daffodils, the celandines, the violets and the bluebells, soon to come. I saw some almost out this afternoon. And there we are. There's the primroses. This is a watercolor by an artist called Anna Airy. It dates from 1955 and belongs to the British Museum. Airy trained at the Slade around about the same time as Augustus John and William Orpin. And during the First World War, she was commissioned to paint factory scenes. She was a regular exhibitor at the RA, worked in pastel oils and, of course, watercolors. And this one shows primroses and violets under a bare hedge, that first sort of hint of spring colour before the trees and the hedges begin to green. Now, this was one of the kind of stars of the show in the exhibition. It's a big painting, about 1.5 meters square, painted by Laura Knight between 1916 and 1920. And it belongs to the Tate now, and we were very grateful that they would lend it to us for the exhibition. And Laura Knight was inspired by primroses that she saw while living in Staithes in Yorkshire, and she decided she wanted to paint something that would conjure up all the things that she loved about springtime. And she wanted to do a big canvas that would get all of those things in. She didn't get started on it until she'd moved to Cornwall, so this is actually showing the Lamorna Valley. And she made it during wartime, when going out sketching on the coast there was against the law. You could be locked up. So she spent her time kind of hiding behind bushes and making surreptitious sketches ready for this picture. But you can see she kind of achieved her ideal. She wanted to get in the signs of spring. So we've got lambs there. There's May blossom coming out. There's gorse flowers. There's a rainbow kind of heralding the better weather coming in as the rain recedes in the distance. And you might just about be able to pick out in the middle there a couple of magpies, two for joy. So it's all there, the wonders of the season. Interesting fact about this painting is that when at some point she decided to paint out the man, the guy with the fly fishing rod there, and replaced him with a figure of a little boy. And she then later regretted that decision. When the picture was on display in Pittsburgh in the States during the 1930s, the pollution there from the steelworks was so bad that the varnish discolored on the picture, and she had to strip it all off. So when she stripped all the varnish off, she took the opportunity to paint out the little boy and put the man back in again. So I guess that was a kind of a serendipitous end to her pollution problems, really. But you know, a lovely and very dramatic picture, a lot of detail there to appreciate. One of the things that we associate also with springtime is, of course, blossom. And this is a railway poster actually from 1955, based on a painting by Frank Sherwin. And it shows, you know, the Garden of England down in Kent. Now, Sherwin was a fairly prolific poster designer working for the railways, and this one really shows a kind of a lane winding through the Kent countryside with spectacular displays of snow white blossom on either side. You can also see hop poles and the oast houses, and just the glimmers of green appearing at the bottom of the hop poles there. What's kind of interesting about this one is it's really aimed to encourage people to travel out into Kent from the cities, and you kind of get the sense that not only will you find yourself in the countryside, but you might find yourself in a completely different era, an era of horse-drawn carts and unspoilt countryside. So just a train journey away from London. Okay, this is Duncan Grant. Duncan Grant was one of the Bloomsbury artists. And he and Vanessa Bell established they moved to the farmhouse at Charleston near Thurle in Sussex in 1916. And they kind of set themselves up there in a home which is now open to the public and decorated by Bloomsbury artists inside. When they got there, they found the gardens were mostly sown with vegetables, so they completely ripped all of that up, redesigned it, re-sowed it, replanted it. And what they were looking for was what they called sweet disorder, but they were also looking for colour. They wanted lots of colour for painting in spring and summer, and you can see that in this painting called The Garden Path in Spring. There's blossom on the trees and sort of bursts of colour in the flower beds beneath. This was actually painted in 1944, and they'd moved out from London back to Charleston to avoid the Blitz in 1939. So this was really something of a refuge. But I don't really think you get a feel of wartime here. It's really a celebration of spring and colour and new growth. Something completely different. We had a number of contemporary artists take part in the exhibition. This is by Carrie Ackroyd, who's a printmaker known particularly for screen prints. This is one. It's called, quite simply, Chiff Chaff, and it shows one of the heralds of spring. So chiff chaffs, some of them overwinter here now, but traditionally they arrived in spring, and hearing their voices in the trees was a sign that the season had arrived. And Carrie says, those two notes constantly chiff-chaffing from somewhere in the fresh foliage always takes me by surprise and are the confirmation of spring. So the bird didn't need to be the main feature of the image, just a presence that can be heard in the surrounding woods and fields. And she's still really spot on with that, because I've heard chiff-chaffs walking around the lanes here, and I've yet to see one. I can hear them, but can I see them? No. So they are quite elusive little creatures, but that kind of chiff-chiff-chaff noise that they make is certainly something that shows that spring is upon us. Now, this rather villainous looking fella is the cuckoo. What sort of better emblem of spring could there be, really? It's a traditional sign that spring is upon us when you first hear the cuckoo. And traditionally, the 14th of April was supposed to be the date that the cuckoos reappeared. Today, they can be heard as early as January in some of the around Kent and London and places like that. But normally, it's about this time of year that we tend to be aware of them. And of course, they have a reputation. They're kind of celebrated in folk song. The song written in the 13th century, "Summer is a Coming In," celebrates the cuckoo. And they're kind of the source of lots of folklore, folk song lyrics and so on. The cuckoo, the cuckold, the bird that lays its nests in other birds' eggs. The chicks then hatch, chuck out all the other birds and eat all the food that the surrogate parents can provide. So, for all their for all the loveliness associated with their call, they are not necessarily a blessing for the rest of the birds. But sadly, numbers of cuckoos are falling. They've dropped by about 50% in just the last 20 years, possibly because of the situation on their migration routes to and from the Congo, also because falling numbers of the caterpillars that they feed on. So it'd be a great shame if we never ever heard a cuckoo in the country again. Their habitats are changing. They're moving from kind of farmland into woodland and wetland. Maybe they'll have more success there. This is a print by Alan William Seeby, and it's part of the St Barbe Museum collection. And I'll talk a little bit more about Seeby in a minute. Right, Robin Tanner again, who did the Christmas etching that we saw earlier. This one's called, it's called Allington in Wiltshire, but it also has an alternative name of the first swallow, although he actually burnished out the swallow. I don't know if you can see it there. Whoops, there we are, just above the cross, just beside the cross on this Chapel of Ease that he appears in the picture. So this is really kind of celebrating the arrival of spring and the sight of that first swallow kind of flitting in the air above. When Tanner produced this print, he was actually living in London, and he said, Allington in Wiltshire was a theme that was very dear to me, and I poured into it all my homesickness and love for the grey stone farms and white lanes of home. Like many of his prints, it's a composite image, bits taken from here and there. But the Chapel of Ease and this sort of pillared cow byre were seen in the village of Allington down in Wiltshire. Okay. Another great emblem of spring, of course, is the Mad March hare. And this is a lino cut by Andrew Haslam, who lives in Suffolk. And he's had a great deal of kind of first-hand experience, actually hand-rearing baby hares, leverets, which had been helpfully collected and brought to his house by his dog. So he knows them really well, and they appear in quite a lot of his prints. This one shows a sort of hare at rest in springtime. You can see the ferns unfurling, and there are another couple of recent arrivals there coming in from Africa. There's a white throat, and in its beak a painted lady butterfly who's come all this way just to get eaten. But there we are. That's nature for you. And of course, the hare, this time of year, if you're lucky, you might see them boxing, where a kind of a reluctant female fights off an amorous male, and you see these kind of mating behaviors and them chasing around the fields. And this is where the phrase "harebrained" comes from. In the past, hares have been associated with kind of witchcraft and ill omen, and they were seen as kind of creatures of bad luck. But today, they're a very much loved part of the countryside. Here we are with Claire Leighton again. This is another of the illustrations from the Farmer's Year. This is the one for April. It's called Sowing, and this was made in 1933. Now, in 1933, hand sowing, hand kind of broadcasting of seed must have been pretty rare. Tractors and horse-drawn seed drills were making the job a lot more efficient and a lot quicker. But here's somebody, performing a job with a skill that had been around for centuries, and it did take skill to kind of evenly broadcast the seed across the furrows so that it, you didn't get clumps of it here and bare patches elsewhere. And there's a real rhythm to the way that they walked across the ground and spread, sowed the seeds from left to right, and you get a sense of that movement here and a sense of kind of heroic labor. It's a very, very striking image. And it's on the cover. This book is still in print, and this one's the one they chose for the cover, and you can see why. Right, this is our last spring image. It's by C.F. Tunnicliffe, who did the Ladybird illustrations. This is a wood engraving that he made in 1942 called The Valley. You can see it shows sheep and lambs resting at the end of the day, and the farmer heading home with his horses. And there's quite a kind of a sort of a nostalgic feel to it. Made during wartime. Tunnicliffe had worked for, he produced posters and artwork for the Dig for Victory campaign, and you can think of some of the posters, your England, your country, fight for it now, and this has got that kind of feel to it, a sort of celebration of the English landscape as something worth fighting for. Tunnicliffe's family had run a farm near Macclesfield in Cheshire, and so that had been his day-to-day experience from birth until he was 19 and left for London to go to art school. And he decided he'd become an artist rather than carry on the family business, but he had a lifelong fascination with farming, and it's a subject that reappears in his work throughout his career. Actually, just before we move to summer, I've just one quote I'd like to share with you. This is from a book called The Seasons by Ralph Whiteman. Now, Whiteman was a farmer, an academic and a writer on all things kind of agricultural and country life. And he just says, comes up with this lovely kind of vision. He says, poets talk of fancy turning to thoughts of love. There is wonder and amazement around every corner of every common lane, yet we are carting manure. The life of the farmer. Okay, so moving on to summer. Now the sun's high in the sky, the temperature is rising, and it's time to be outdoors, a time for outings, picnics, holidays. The colours of the landscape are changing again. There's heather in bloom on the forest heaths, the corn's ripening in the fields. The trees and the hedges, the green of those is deepening. Flowers are appearing in gardens and proliferating, and the buzz of insects adds to the kind of warm and drowsy atmosphere. Although for the farmer, it's no time for holidays, as this was their busiest season with the corn and hay harvests to bring in. Okay, we're starting here with another contemporary artist who was shown in the exhibition. This is by James Lynch. It's called Ted's Greenhouse Summer. And it's an egg tempera on gesso coated panel. Lynch works almost exclusively in egg tempera, building up his paintings through lots and lots of translucent layers with a method that goes back to the Renaissance. He lives in Somerset, and his main subjects are the agricultural landscapes of Wessex. He's also a keen paraglider, so a lot of his paintings have this sort of amazing aerial view, and you get this sense of the landscape laid out like a map beneath. And skies and clouds are another thing that's very important in his work, and you can see that in this sort of slightly more intimate painting. The two pictures that he gave us for the show were both of gardens rather than his sort of wider landscapes, and this one kind of shows peonies and lupins and poppies in bloom in this very well tended garden with the fields and the trees beyond. This is Carrie Ackroyd again. It's a screen print that she made for the cover of a book by Clive Chatters, who some of you will know very well. Clive's book on Heathland was published last year, and I'm sure if you haven't got a copy, you'll rush out and get one with this lovely cover to appreciate. Carrie told me that Clive was slightly reluctant about having blooming purple heather on the cover because he felt it was a bit of a cliche as far as Heathland's concerned. But Carrie said he had to have the colour in there to be appealing, and it's what a lot of people associate with our heaths. But what they both wanted was to kind of give that sense of the New Forest as a living and working environment. So you've got that sense of a diversity of habitats. You've got heathland, you've got copses, you've got woodland, and you've got the houses and the commoners' animals. It's all happening, a dynamic environment where people live, work and relax. And also there you can see with the heather blooms, there's some gorse blooms and a stone chat singing down in the foreground at the front there. This is Alan William Seeby again, another a watercolour on linen from gouache on linen from the St Barbe collection. Seeby became the head of art at Reading School of Art, and he came down to the New Forest for his holidays during the 1920s and 1930s and really fell in love with the place and sort of built up a real connection with the ponies, the wild ponies that he saw. And that led to a number of illustrations and paintings and the books that he wrote about Britain's pony breeds and things like Skewbald, the New Forest pony, that he wrote for children as well. This one's called Head to Tail, and it shows a couple of ponies standing front to back like that so they can swish the flies away from each other with their tails. And there's the foal, recently born in the spring, enjoying the warm sunshine. Right, Ladybird. This is C.F. Tunnicliffe again. This illustration was chosen as the cover for What to Look For in Summer. It's called Wild Rose, Briar Rose and Elderflower on a Stone Wall and dates from 1960. And you can see there are some of those sort of features of summer. There's the elderflower blooming, the rose is blooming, meadow brown butterflies on the collecting the nectar, swallows flying, and a tractor cutting the hay in the background. It's really kind of quintessential view of summer in the countryside. And one of the key things in the world of farming is the hay harvest in the summertime. And this is a painting by James Bateman. It's called Haytime in the Cotswolds and was completed in 1939. The world of farming and rural landscapes are the main focus of Bateman's work. He taught at Cheltenham School of Art, so the Cotswold landscape would have been quite familiar to him. During the Second World War, he was commissioned to portray the Women's Land Army, so he was known very much as a kind of agricultural artist. This one's quite handy in that it sort of lays out the process of bringing in the hay harvest. You can see down in the foreground there's a couple of men with scythes working their way along, cutting down the grass. In the background, you can see where the grass has been cut and laid out in rows to dry. There are haycocks where it's been gathered together to keep the rain off should the weather turn. And you can also see the hay being sort of forked up into carts and then brought down into the farmyard down in the foreground where the haystacks are being made. You can see one that's been completed, one that they're working on, and the slightly darker looking one behind is one from last year that's been partially cut away for animal food during the winter and the autumn and winter. And this is really just to give you a kind of a sense of that life in reality. This is another photograph from the St Barbe collection. It shows haymaking at Clay Hill near Lyndhurst. And you can see that haymaking was a time which really brought all sorts of people together. Everyone would come and join in and help to get the work done while the weather holds. You know, the famous saying, make hay while the sun shines. And there you can see them with their hay rakes, having done a lot of the work, and they're in the process of building that big stack behind. If you're wondering what the strange contraption is over the top there, that's a kind of fairly elaborate sort of rick cloth. Almost looks like they're building a marquee or something. And that's there to keep the rain off while they're making the stack and before it's been thatched like the ones you can see on the right-hand side. Now we're back to Graham Sutherland again here. A much more kind of rosy view of the countryside than the one we saw earlier. This was made 4 years before in 1925, and it's called Crayfields, and it was a subject that he found down in Kent. And on the left-hand side, you can see a pen and ink drawing by Samuel Palmer, who was the big influence on Sutherland and some of his contemporaries. And Palmer was down in Shoreham about 100 years, in fact, exactly 100 years earlier than Sutherland, Shoreham in Kent. And he kind of transformed the Kentish landscape into this vision of paradise on earth, this sort of wonderful, bounteous place of sort of peace and sort of healthy labour, I suppose. And you can see that echoed in Sutherland's picture on the right, where you've got the sun shining through the hot poles and a couple of kind of workers working their way through, wearily through the cut corn on their way home at the end of the day. But very much inspired by Samuel Palmer, particularly his etchings. Now, another one of the stars of the show at St Barbe was Alan Reynolds. This is a painting called Summer, Young September's Cornfield, that was made in 1954. Now, Reynolds had a great love of nature, and his early work was very much part of the neo-romantic movement that was notable in England during the 1940s and the 1950s. Again, inspired by Samuel Palmer, but the work of the neo-romantic sometimes had a darker atmosphere that reflected the stresses and strains of wartime in which they were largely working. And in this one, you know, you've got this wonderful view of the golden fields of corn and orchards beyond, but that dark sky and these spiky forms in the foreground just give the picture a kind of an edge all the same. This was exhibited in an exhibition called The Four Seasons, held in 1956, and that was really the kind of the apogee of his fame and popularity. During the 1960s, his work gradually became more abstract, and from 1968 onwards, he threw himself entirely into constructivism, making sort of modular drawings and just plain white reliefs, and that was what occupied him for the rest of his career. So a complete change from sort of landscape work like this one. Okay, this is C.F. Tunnicliffe, once again, one of his etchings. And this shows the family farm up at Lane End, Sutton, near Macclesfield. And the gentleman in the middle behind the corn stooks is probably Tunnicliffe's father, who ran the farm, the family farm. You can see this is a scene of the corn harvest, which happened usually, if the hay harvest was traditionally in June, the corn harvest was usually happening August, September. And you can see in the background there is the binder that is working its way through the field, cutting the corn, but also binding it into sheaves. So a labour-saving device, so that all the workers have to do in the foreground is just pick up those sheaves and gather them into stooks where they can finish off drying. They arrange them in such a way that the wind can blow through and dry the whole of it. So that was perhaps 50 years before, or certainly 100 years before, you'd have seen people with rows and rows of people with scythes working on this task. But the binder certainly speeded things up. And there we have a binder in a field at Keyhaven. This is another photograph from the St Barbe collection. This is the end of the day. You can see all those rows of sheaves stacked up to dry, and there's the binder resting, as it were, at the end of a hard day's work. Just sort of by way of a sort of a finale on this subject, there's a book called Ask the Fellows Who Cut the Hay, which was written by George Ewart Evans, published in 1956, and he was a kind of pioneering oral history recorder, and he sort of captured the memories of people in Suffolk during the 1950s and their memories of what life was like in agriculture even in the previous century. And he commented, thinking about the way that the harvest was gathered in the 1950s, at harvest time, there were crowds of reapers in the fields, crowds also of women and children tying up the sheaves of corn and doing other light but necessary jobs. Everybody was involved, and the ritual of the harvest made it a truly communal occasion. Where 20 men formerly spent 3 weeks with scythes or binders harvesting the corn, today a couple of men with a combine harvester will do the same work in a few afternoons. Okay, and on to our final season, our last group of artworks. Autumn, I think, will kind of forever be associated with Keats' description of it as the season of mellow fruitfulness. It has this kind of dual character of ease and plenty after the work of the harvests have been brought in. But it's also the harbinger of winter, sometimes seen as a melancholy time when cornfields are reduced to stubble, flowers wither and leaves turn and fall. There's a tendency also for people to ponder on mortality and the ephemeral nature of life and its pleasures in autumn. But of course, it's not really an end. It's just another stage in the cycle. And we can very much view autumn as being the kind of fulfillment of the promise of spring and summer. This is an underground poster designed by Dora Batty, not Nora Batty. It was made in 1926, encouraging Londoners to get out into the country and brave the brisk winds of autumn and to appreciate the changing colours of the falling leaves. Batty made about designed about 60 posters for London Transport in the 1920s and 30s, but she's not as well known as some of her male counterparts. She also taught textile design and designed ceramics for Poole Pottery. And this poster really shows a very stylish and self-assured woman enjoying the bracing winds as the sun sets. This is a painting from the Hampshire Cultural Trust collection. It's by W.H. Allen, who was the director of the Farnham School of Art and a key figure in the cultural life of the town. The surrounding countryside was really the main subject for his paintings. Agricultural landscapes, historic buildings, village scenes, traditional crafts and farming activity. And you can see here the big autumn job of ploughing is getting underway. You can just see there's a horse plough team there starting work under the changing colours of birch, oak and elm. You can see coming into autumn here how the palette is changing. You can see between these few pictures that I'm going to show you that we're into this time of kind of russets and browns and khakis. This is by Paul Nash. It's called Michaelmas Landscape. It was painted in 1943, just 3 years before he died. And you can very much sort of get the sense of those autumn colours here. Around this time, Nash was painting a lot of studies of the Whittenham clumps in Berkshire and was kind of fascinated by the way they changed across the seasons. Some of the works were linked to the spring equinox and others to the phases of the moon, and this one to Michaelmas at the end of September. And no doubt Nash was a very, very sort of intelligent, eloquent writer as well, and he'd been well aware of the kind of the symbolism of autumn decay as he was reaching the end of his life. This is a painting by Ivan Hitchens, belongs to the British Council. It's called Autumn Trees with Distant Hill, painted between 1947 and 8. Now, during the war, Hitchens' Hampstead home was bombed, and so they moved to Lavington Common near Petworth in Sussex. And capturing the changing aspects of the woods there as the seasons turned provided him with a real lifetime of subjects. He said, "I do try to say clearly and directly by tone and colour what I feel is the essence of the object, and I see no point in building this up with many little strokes, where one will suffice and can be more vital." And that's very much sort of sums up his style, really. On a first glance, it might appear completely abstract, but the more that you look at it, particularly if you see it firsthand, you get to see where, you know, we have a tree trunk here with branches. There's another tree and foliage there, and more tree trunks over here. Perhaps a stream running along here, and there is the kind of the hill that he mentions in the title, with a cloudy sky and sunlight kind of coming through the gaps in the clouds to sort of provide this golden light in places. So again, it really captures those autumn colours in a very distinctive and original form. Now, in terms of wildlife, or certainly in terms of bird life, the autumn is a time of arrival and departures. So on the left-hand side, we've got C.F. Tunnicliffe's illustration from What to Look For in Autumn, which shows swifts and swallows gathering on the rooftops of the village of Maltreath on Anglesey, where he moved in 1947. And he said that he saw them coming in hundreds, twittering excitedly all about the roof and garden. And in the afternoon, the slate of the roofs, as well as the ridge tiles, were populated with them as they basked in the bright sunlight. And he's really captured that beautifully in this watercolour. On the right-hand side, as the swallows are departing, heading south, coming in from Scandinavia are the fieldfares and the redwings, and these are fieldfares captured by Carrie Ackroyd in another of her screen prints. And she says, "The date when these winter thrushes arrive depends on conditions in Scandinavia, but suddenly there will be a gathering of them moving down the hedgerows, feeding on the autumn berries or calling to each other as they fly towards a buffet on the other bushes. They fly with a hesitation, a moment with the wings held still. As winter comes on, they must feed on the ground, faring over frosty fields. I never see them leave in spring. I just notice one day that they have gone." And in particularly hard winters, you'll find them in urban gardens seeking out food. And Carrie has shown them here, feasting on berries in the hedge, in amongst, looks like hawthorn berries in the hedgerows. Another New Forest artist, Hayward Sumner. This is a watercolour from 1910 called The Fern Cart. Hayward Sumner moved to Gourley in the north of the forest in 1904. He'd been involved in the arts and crafts movement, designing wallpapers, textiles, book illustrations, and also sgraffito decorations for churches and houses. But when he moved to Gourley, he kind of immersed himself in the local landscape and the local life, really, finding out about everything he could as an archaeologist, as an artist, and as a countryman. In 1910, he published a thing called the Book of Gourley, based on his discoveries and interests about the forest. And this painting is based on one of the illustrations from that book, called Splash Bridge near Hollyhatch. And Sumner here shows a fern cart heavily laden creaking its way along a forest track. And this fern gathered in one of the kind of autumn harvests. He talks about holly being the winter harvest in the forest and fern being the harvest in the autumn. And this would then be used for bedding for animals in the local farms and for the local commoners as well. He's got this lovely kind of contrast in the lighting. Everything in the foreground is in shadow, but the hill in the background is caught in the kind of the fading sunlight, and it sort of really comes to life, almost a sort of supernatural kind of look to it. This is John Minton, one of those near-romantic artists from the sort of war years. This is called Hop Pickers, and it was painted in 1945. And of course, so the end of August and September, really the time for hopping in Kent, a time when gypsies and East Enders in their thousands and itinerant workers would arrive to gather in the harvest, kind of paid holiday for some of them, doing piecework and earning money for how many hops they could pick in the day. George Orwell went and spent a couple of weeks hop picking in 1931, and this is rather a lovely quote from him. "On hot days, there is no pleasanter place than the shady lanes of hops with their bitter scent, an unutterably refreshing scent, like a wind blowing from oceans of cool beer. It would almost be ideal if one could earn a living at it." But unfortunately, he found it was very hard on the hands, and he couldn't even make £1 a week. So you'd be hard pushed to make a living as a hop picker. John Minton, one of the leading lights of the neo-romantics, found success as a painter and illustrator, taught at Camberwell School of Art, but he struggled to adapt to the changing art world of the late 1950s and sadly committed suicide, aged just 39, in 1957. So another artist who was lost to us too early. Okay, we're looking at some of the other harvests from this time of year. On the left-hand side, here's a familiar sight from the New Forest in the autumn. Pigs out for pannage, or the common of mast, as it's known in this area. Commoners can put their pigs out to forage on the forest, the idea being that they'll fatten up on chestnuts, beech masts, and most importantly, acorns, which can be toxic if they're eaten by cattle and horses. On the right-hand side, we've got a wood engraving by Gertrude Hermes called Autumn Fruits from 1935. And this shows some of the other sort of foragers' delights from this time of year. You can see mushrooms and blackberries. There's some teals in there, and of course, conkers for that sort of traditional playground game of autumn, and source of bruised knuckles for many of us in our past. And one little thing about the blackberries shown there, you should always make sure that you don't pick any more blackberries after the 29th of September, which is Michaelmas, because when the devil was thrown out of heaven by St. Michael, he landed in a bramble bush and he cursed it and spat on it. So if you pick your blackberries after the 29th, they'll be horrible. Right, this is Claire Leighton, September from the Farmer's Year. This is apple picking. She travelled down to the apple orchards of Kent to experience the harvest firsthand, from early morning dew to midday heat and then the peace of evening. And her focus once again is on the kind of skilled work of the pickers as they gather and sort the apples before they're transported, as she imagined, for grey-faced people in the cities who never saw an apple shine upon the topmost bough against the blue of a September sky. Her print for October shows cider making down in Devon as a kind of a step onwards from this one. Right, we've just got a couple more slides to go, and then we're out of autumn and out of the seasons. This one is all about threshing. Once upon a time, threshing was done by hand with flails. It was a job that could last the agricultural workers almost all the way through the winter. So when the threshing machine was introduced in the 19th century, there were riots because the workers thought they were going to lose their jobs. But of course, the threshing machine eventually became an accepted part of agricultural life. And you can see in Gwen Raverat's wood engraving in the top left there, there's the steam engine driving the thresher, which is separating the corn, the grains from the chaff and the straw, and then being sort of funneled up on a conveyor up to the men on the top of the stack, making the straw stack there to store it for bedding and so on for the winter. Bottom left, this is a threshing scene from Flanders Farm in Hordle, down our way here. And again, you can see the threshing machine there working. They're feeding it with the corn, and the straw is being fed out on the conveyor up onto the belts, and the grain is being deposited into sacks that you can just see on the right hand side. And of course, the thatching of these stacks was vitally important to keep the weather off them during the winter, so that the straw could be used for bedding. And on the right hand side, we see C.F. Tunnicliffe's illustration showing himself as a boy helping his father after he got home from school, thatching the rick. On a big farm, they'd employ thatchers to do this, but on a small farm like the Tunnicliffe's farm, it was something that you did for yourself. Okay, the final slide. This is an engraving by Stanley Anderson. Stanley Anderson was one of the teachers at Goldsmith School of Art, and he taught etching to people like Graham Sutherland that we saw earlier. He's probably best known for a set of engravings he did cataloguing disappearing rural crafts, but he also had a great interest and love of traditional farming practice. And this print really captures that special bond between the ploughman and his horses. The bare trees in the background, and the fact that the ploughman's got to put his coat on to keep warm during this feed break, because there's a sense that perhaps autumn is giving way now to winter. And if the bare earth looks a bit bleak and the landscape looks a bit bare, I suppose the thing to bear in mind here is that the work that they're doing now in ploughing the soil and preparing is all ready for the sowing of the next season's crop come the spring, and then the whole cycle begins all over again. Thank you very much. That's Season's End.
That was lovely. Anybody there? Thank you. That was wonderful. And I just wish now that you could go back and rehang all the artwork so that I could see it with your insight. Does anybody have any questions for Steve? I'm going to try and remove the spotlight on Steve and look at the gallery view. There we are. Right. Does anybody have any questions?
Prue, it's John. I'll start off firstly thanking Steve very much for a fascinating talk, but really asking him, I've never really thought about it this way, but when there's such a choice from farming to gardens to nature, how Steve, do you get from, you must have thousands of images, how do you get it down to the 100 or so that you can actually put into the exhibition? What process do you go through?
Well, it's a complicated one. I mean, some of it comes down to pragmatism. It's about what's available. You know, there are these images out there, but what can we borrow? Transporting fine art is an expensive business, so we try to kind of concentrate on bringing things in from a particular area where loads can be shared. So there's that side, but from a curatorial point of view, I suppose we really came up with some of the key themes that we thought of, and the things that maybe people really associate with particular seasons, and then looked out to see what works were there that represented that. So, what was there to show ploughing, which is the big autumn job? What was there to show sowing in the spring? What are the plants that we think of at particular times of year? What are the things that that we make. You know, what makes you think of spring, for example? I mean, one thing we didn't have in the exhibition, for example, was there were no pictures of bluebells, and that was really down to the fact that we couldn't find something that really displayed that was easy to get hold of. You know, we weren't going to bring something down from Scotland for for the sake of a bluebell. We just let people use their imaginations. So it's partly that, and it's also, I suppose, what the artists focused on, because they some of the same things appeal to them. You know, there are things that have scenes of harvesting were popular, scenes of bare trees in winter is popular, snow scenes of winter. So some of those decisions were made for us in a way.
Steve, there's a question on the chat from Bill Petts asking, did you consider Howard Phipps?
We did consider Howard Phipps, and he was in the exhibition, but I didn't include him in the talk. So the talk tonight, there were about 40 images. The exhibition, I think we had 70 plus. So yes, Howard, he's a fantastic wood engraver, lino cutter. We had one of his prints of sort of winter stubble fields with a hill fort in the background, was really beautiful, beautiful thing. And also another one of snowdrops. And there's a kind of a classic winter plant giving a hint of spring to come, so we wanted to include those sorts of things. So I know Bill, like me, is a fan of Howard's work. So his mission is not down to him not being in the show, but just for not to be keeping here for hours and hours and hours, keeping you all busy tonight.
Yeah. I'm putting my hand up. Can I just say that I did manage to get to this exhibition, and I had hoped to go back a second time, because I thought it was one of the loveliest exhibitions I had ever seen at St. Barbe. I loved it.
Thank you, Pam. It was a bit of a labour of love. I mean, I think we really enjoyed putting it together, and I also think it had a particular resonance because of the lockdown. The fact that here we were sort of reconnecting with nature, I suppose, and perhaps looking at nature again in a different light. And in that sense, it was really lovely to have done it there. The downside was that another lockdown, it fell victim to another lockdown in due course.
Yes, which is why I couldn't get back a second time. But so many of those pictures are absolutely exquisite. And I don't like to say this, but I'm afraid I do remember when I lived in Woodside as a child, after the war, there were 3 farms in Woodside: Ridgeway, Normandy Farm, and I think it was called Setters down in Lower Pennington Lane. And I remember very well, and I have a photograph of myself with my grandfather. We'd been stooking the corn, and it's with Eric Smith, the farmer, and the horses with the binder.
Oh, lovely. I think the museum would, Pam, the museum would like to see that picture.
All right. Okay.
Any more questions? No? Okay. Well, I'm going to unashamedly do a small promo for Steve and Jill, who put together this wonderful book called Seasons. It's available online at the moment, or you can buy it when the shop is open again in May. But it does go through the exhibition and the philosophy behind it, and it's wonderful.
Oh, lovely.
So please do think about buying it. And that just remains for me to say we look forward to seeing you again on the 7th of May, same format, and Tony King will talk about the prehistory and the Romans in the New Forest. Okay, thank you everybody, and have a good weekend.
Well, thank you to Steve. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very much indeed.
Thank you.
And I'm recording this, so it will be available online if anybody missed it. Right. Good night, everybody. Good night, Steve, and thank you. Have a good weekend.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.